Hello again, my AP Econers. So we've got our micro unit 3 review today. So we've got two big things that we're covering, cost curves, and then that leads right into perfect competition and all the nuances of that. So some important definitions and concepts here. And as always, if you go on this video, on the description under the YouTube, you'll see the specific time frames that where each of these concepts are talked about if you want to jump right to that. And it'll also be on this document that I post after I get done. So we got a lot of things to cover here. We're just going to get to it and get right, go through it. So first of all, just a quick definition type thing, two different types of profits that we talk about, accounting profit and economic profit. Okay, so the formula for each, accounting profit is your total revenue minus your explicit costs. When you think explicit costs, you always want to think anything that is a tangible cost, something that has a receipt, something that you paid money out to. You're going to pay money for workers, you're going to pay money for resources, you're going to pay money in taxes and in building or mortgage or loans or all these other things, right? So that's your accounting profit. Economic profit is your total revenue minus both your explicit and your implicit costs. Implicit costs are like your opportunity costs or the things that you give up in order to have or do something. So a good example here, you have a job that pays $40,000 a year. You leave that to start your own business. Now in the first year, you make a total of $100,000 in revenue. Your explicit costs are $70,000. So you go to your accountant friend and your accountant friend says, how'd you do this year? And you say, well, pretty good. I made 100 grand. I paid out 70,000, and your accountant friend says, congratulations. You are a successful business owner. You made $30,000 in profit this year. Way to go. The next day, you're talking to your economist friend, and you're telling him the story or her the story, and your economist friend says, well, wait a minute. Didn't you leave a job in order to start this business? How much did that job pay? And you say, well, yeah, that job paid $40,000 a year. And your economist friend says, you're an idiot. You left a $40,000 a year job to start your own business in which you made $30,000. You are actually negative $10,000 worse this year than you were last year because of this, because economic profit takes into consideration those implicit costs or those opportunity costs, what you give up. And so as economists, of course, this is not a course in accounting, this is a course in economics. We are always concerned with economic profit. So as we go through this and we talk about profit and this and that, we always assume that we're discussing economic profit and we've factored in those implicit costs. All right. Real quick, good important reminder about the short and long run time frame. So the first thing you need to know are the definition of fixed resources or variable resources. Fixed resources are those that do not vary with output. Easiest example would be something like machinery or equipment. Given the example, if you have a pizza restaurant, you buy a pizza oven. You spend whatever, $1,000 for your pizza oven. It doesn't really matter if you make 0 pizzas, or 10 pizzas, or 100 pizzas, or 1,000 pizzas, or 10,000 pizzas, you paid $1,000 for your pizza oven. Okay, so no matter how many pizzas you make, that pizza oven is a static cost. It does not change. Variable resources are just what they sound like. They do vary with output. So if you want to make more pizzas, guess what? You need more cheese. You need more dough, you need more sauce, you need more workers, you need more electricity, you need more of all these things. And so the more pizzas you make, these things will increase. So that's the difference between fixed and variable. Now that's important because that factors into our time frames. So in the immediate short run, there's not enough time to adjust anything. Both your fixed resources and your variable resources cannot change, and you're kind of stuck in this position. And so a good example, you're working your pizza, it's a typical slow Tuesday night, all of a sudden a bus filled with 50 people or so shows up unexpectedly at your pizza restaurant. Well, at that point, there's not enough time to call in the cavalry, right, and get more workers in and make sure you have enough cheese. You're kind of stuck. You might be limited with how many pizzas you can make for them and how long it's going to take because you didn't know that that was happening. All right, now, how long does that last? It's not a specific time frame. It depends on how long you can get more variable resources. As soon as you can get more variable resources, we are now entering the short run. So the immediate usually isn't that long, okay? It depends on the industry, but as long as you can start changing up your variable resources, you're now in the short run. So in the short run, You can change your variable resources, but there's not enough time to change your fixed resources. Your machinery, equipment, your building, your factory, whatever, those things are still constant, but you can hire more workers, you can get more cheese dough and things like that. So again, a good example, you get a phone call, hey, this coming Tuesday or this next Tuesday, we're gonna be showing up around 7 p.m. with a bus filled with 50 people and coming from a trip or whatever, and so just to give you a heads up, now you have enough time to say, all right, next Tuesday I'm going to put more workers on the schedule. I'm going to make sure we have enough cheese and dough, and I'm going to have some things ready to go. And so that's our short run time frame. And then of course in the long run, everything's variable. In the long run, there's enough time to build new factories or invest in new technology or machinery and equipment and things like that, change your capital. Again, how long is that? How long does it take to change those things? Depends on the industry. For some industries, maybe a month. For some industries, maybe several years. Okay, it just depends entirely on the industry and how long it takes to get everything in this position where it can be changed. Okay, so that's our long run. Now, how does that factor into things? Well, the marginal product curve here that we're going to talk about, this is assuming we're in the short run, okay, where this is going to be a factor. So, okay, again, a couple quick definitions. Total product is the total number of units produced by all workers. That's what this top curve is indicating. So I'm hiring more workers and my output is either going up or begins to go down at some point. Marginal product, of course, is if I hire another worker, how many additional units are going to be made because of that worker, that particular worker. Okay, and that's what this bottom curve is going to show us, is what we call the marginal product. It also puts the average on there. Average doesn't show up very often, but marginal is the one we're concerned about. Now, 3 phases to marginal product. If you notice, there's this phase at first where you hire more workers and they're adding, each worker adds additional product. So the first worker you hire, maybe they make 5 pizzas. Then you hire a second worker and they make a total of 10 pizzas. What that means is the first worker, if you went from 0 to 1 workers, that second worker added 5 pizzas. If you go from 1 worker to 2 workers, now your total goes to 15, so the additional is 10, right? Because you go from 5 to 15. That's an increasing marginal return or marginal product, okay? So this phase where, excuse me, you're hiring additional workers and the marginal product is increasing. If they ask you to explain this on the test, the best explanation, you almost use one word, and that is specialization. Okay, instead of one person trying to do everything, which is very cumbersome, you're having to switch from task to task, you hire several workers and they specialize. And by specializing, they can increase their output exponentially. That doesn't last forever, however. There's this point where you hire additional workers and marginal product, while still positive, starts to diminish or starts to go down. You're hiring additional workers, they're not making as many or adding as many as the workers before them. And that's what we call diminishing marginal product. Okay, now notice, again, if we're looking up at our graphs here, total product is still increasing during, not quite as steeply, but it's still increasing during this phase, just not as much because it's still positive. As long as it's positive, you're adding more total pizzas or whatever, but just not as many. This is primarily due to the fact that you are adding variable resources to fixed resources, which in the short run are unchanging. So again, if you have 1 pizza oven, there's a limit to how many you could hire 1 million workers. With just 1 pizza oven, there's only so many pizzas that you can make, and that's just a reality, okay? So that's the problem. You can even get to a point where you hire more workers and marginal product actually goes negative, meaning you actually lose total pizzas or whatever. And the reason for that is, of course, you're starting to hire more workers and they're actually getting in each other's way, distracting each other, causing problems, this and that. And obviously that's not a good position to be in. So again, there's a limit to how much you can produce at the end of the day in the short run because fixed resources cannot change. All right, now let's look at, that's a blank page, that's fun. Hopefully there's more on the next page. There we go. Short run costs. Okay, so costs in the short run, again, all these things that we just described, time frame, fixed cost, fixed resources versus variable resources, all these things, increasing marginal returns, diminishing, these are all going to play into these graphs that we're going to look at from here on out. So these are total cost curves. If you notice, your fixed cost curve is flat or horizontal or constant, because remember, fixed costs do not change with output. That pizza oven cost you $1,000, whether you made 0 pizzas or 1,000 pizzas, it's still $1,000. It does not change. Variable resources, of course, we know they do change with output, and so it starts at 0. If you don't make any pizzas, there are no variable. You didn't buy any dough, cheese, sauce, hire a worker, or anything like that. If you want to make a pizza though, guess what? You got to buy these things. The more pizzas you want to make, the more of these things you have to buy. So variable costs start going up, and if you notice, it goes up kind of slowly at first. That's because of what we just learned, increasing marginal returns. Workers are specializing and they're making more additional pizzas as you hire more workers, but eventually you get into that diminishing and it goes up at a much quicker rate. And then, of course, you have your total cost curve. Total costs are simply fixed costs plus variable costs. Okay, so the two of them together. So if you notice, total costs and variable costs, they mirror each other or parallel each other. And that's because the distance between these two curves, these little arrows here, are the same distance as whatever your fixed costs are, right? So because total cost is variable plus fixed, fixed does not change. So the distance between is always equal to fixed cost, and that's why the distance between them is a constant, because fixed costs do not change. All right, now, again, it's important to understand these curves. You won't see them a lot. We see the averages much, much more often, but again, understanding why these curves are what they are helps us understand why the averages are what they are, which is what comes next. So here's our average cost in the short run that we're looking at, and so you've got your average fixed cost. To figure that out, it's your fixed cost divided by your output. Now, why do average fixed costs continually decline? Because your fixed costs do not change, but your output is getting bigger and bigger. Or to look at it this way, when your numerator does not change, but your denominator keeps getting bigger and bigger, this number keeps getting smaller and smaller. And so, of course, the more you make, that $1,000 pizza oven averaged out over more and more pizzas becomes less and less. And so average fixed cost goes down. Average variable cost, you figure that out by doing variable cost divided by your output, okay? And again, if you notice, your average variable cost curve initially declines. That's because you're getting your increasing marginal returns in that phase. And then it starts going up, and that's where you get your diminishing, okay? And so it goes like that. You've got your average total cost. Two ways of figuring out average total cost. You could do total cost divided by output. That works fine. You could also do average fixed cost plus average variable cost. Both of those should get you the same exact number. All right. Now, for that reason, if you'll notice, here's your ATC and here's your AVC down here. And if you notice, the gap between them starts out big, and then the gap between them is getting smaller and smaller. Why is that? Well, guess what's getting smaller and smaller? AFC. And the distance between these two curves is equal to AFC, whatever, right? Because average total cost is average variable plus average fixed. Average fixed gets smaller and smaller, so average total and average variable get closer and closer. So the distance between these two curves, whereas up here, the distance between them is equal to fixed cost, but it's constant because this doesn't change. Down here with the averages, your average fixed cost is getting smaller and smaller, as is the gap between them. Okay, now we added this additional wrinkle on here, a very important curve, your marginal cost curve. Marginal cost is simply, what's marginal? The additional. So the additional cost of producing another pizza. If I want to go from 10 pizzas to 11 pizzas, how much more money is that going to cost me? All right, now, a couple things you notice about the marginal cost curve. Most importantly, marginal cost intersects AVC and ATC at their lowest point. Okay, notice AVC is going down. It hits that MC, and after it hits that MC curve, it starts, as soon as MC rises above it, it starts going up. ATC does the same thing, goes down, hits that MC, starts coming up. Again, the analogy I always give in class is likening it to your grade. You guys know how grades work, you've done them your whole life. If your average in my class is a 90%, and you get a 70 on the next test, okay, you know what it's going to do to your average. It's going to lower your average. You don't come up to me and say, ooh, I got a 70 on this test. Is that going to lower my average? You know it's going to lower it. What do you ask? How much is it going to lower, right? So as long as the next one or the additional grade is lower than the average, it brings that average down. Same thing is happening here. Eventually, though, what happens is that marginal cost crosses and now is higher than it. So if you have a 90 in my class and you get a 98 on the next test, you know it's going to raise your grade. You don't ask, is it going to raise my grade? You know it's going to raise it. The question is, how much? Okay, so as long as the next one is above the average, it raises that average up, just like it would a grade. And then the other thing about marginal costs, marginal costs are directly related to variable costs, because what does marginal measure? The change in cost from one to the next. What do variable costs do? They change from one unit to the next. And so marginal and variable are going to be directly related. On the other hand, marginal has nothing to do with fixed costs. Because do fixed costs change from unit to unit? No, they do not. And marginal cost is measuring the change in, and there is no change in, so marginal has nothing to do with fixed costs. So, I always like to give this little summary. If a fixed cost changes, if your monthly rent goes up, if the cost of your yearly insurance goes up, if taxes go up, a lump sum tax or something like that, if that increases or decreases, changes one way or the other, it'll definitely change AFC, right? Because AFC is fixed cost divided by output, and your fixed costs have changed, so your AFC is going to change. It also changes ATC, right? Because ATC is AFC plus AVC, and your AFC has changed. So that makes sense, but again, is completely independent of your variable cost and your marginal cost. Has nothing to do with them. They will not change at all. If a variable cost changes, if the price of your workers changes, if the price of your cheese or your dough or your electricity changes, your advertising, whatever, that will change obviously your AVC, because a variable cost changed, so now that's going to affect the average variable cost. Naturally, it changes ATC, because ATC is AFC plus AVC, and your AVC has changed. And it also affects your marginal cost, because variable and marginal directly related, right? They tie in, so you change variable cost, you change a marginal cost. Okay, so that would be an example of like a per unit, whereas a fixed cost, lump sums, we'll talk about that later. Lump sums are fixed cost, variable costs are per unit. All right, so that's understanding the cost curves. Now, what we need to do next, talk about long run, that's all in the short run. Okay, in the long run. Now remember the definition of the long run, everything is variable. Nothing is fixed in the long run, so there's really only technically one curve. In theory, there are two curves. There's a variable cost curve, average variable cost curve, and a total cost curve. But now, because there is no fixed, variable and total are the same, so we just basically say there's total, and that's all we worry about, right? So essentially there's only total costs or average total costs in the long run. Now, this average total cost curve, which you can see more delineated down here, okay, as one big continuous curve, is really a compilation of many short-run average total cost curves based on different sizes of factory capital and things like that. So I always use the example, this first curve here, short-run average cost curve could be a 1,000 square foot unit that you've got your pizza restaurant in. If you want to go up to a 1,500 square foot unit, okay, that's going to change your average total cost in the short run. If you go to a 2,000 square foot unit and so forth. So this just represents kind of all the various average total cost curves at the different sizes of production that you could possibly produce. And we generalize it to just kind of show one big, long average total cost curve. But it's really a compilation of a bunch of little short-run average total cost curves. Anyway, in the long run, you have these three potential phases. The one is where you get bigger and you get more efficient. Okay, you produce on a larger scale, and it's lowering your average total cost in the long run. And that phase, when this curve is downward sloping, is called our economies of scale phase. Okay, you're producing more and it's getting cheaper. You might have, depends on the industry and a bunch of factors, but you might have a period where those average costs are flat or they've bottomed out. If you have that phase, it's called the constant returns. But that doesn't last forever. You can't just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and getting better and better and more efficient. At some point, you can get bigger and your costs actually start to go up because you lose efficiency, mismanagement. Think of trying to manage a factory that's the size of an entire city. That would be very difficult to do, to make sure this part is working with this part and so forth. And so eventually you run into inefficiencies, and that's what we call diseconomies of scale. Okay? Now, let's take these concepts and apply them to our first type of market that we're going to look at. Of course, there are 4 types of markets. The first one is perfect competition. 4 key characteristics to perfect competition. A firm in this industry, there are going to be many, many sellers, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of sellers in these industries. Easy entry and exit. It's not that hard to get in or get out of these particular markets, and I'll give examples in a second. The product that they're making is pretty much the same. Okay, everyone across the board is making the same thing. It doesn't really matter who makes it. It's going to be the same. It's hard to differentiate. And they are a price taker. Price taker means that the market determines the price, and the individual firm, because he or she is only a drop in the bucket. Okay, remember, there are thousands of other firms making the same thing. You have no influence whatsoever over the market. You're simply too small a cog in the machine to make any kind of difference by yourself. Okay, and so the firm has to take whatever the market determines the price is. So best examples of these, of course, the example you're most likely to be given is some kind of agricultural product. Potato is a good example. Could be anything, corn, whatever, but potato is a potato. For the most part, how many people grow potatoes? Again, if you include how many people have potatoes in their backyards, there are probably hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions of people that grow potatoes in this country. This year you grew potatoes, next year what the heck? Grow corn, grow soybeans, grow wheat, grow something else, right? It's not that hard to get in and out of these markets. Again, I could just determine to till up part of my backyard and plant some potatoes. It's not that hard to do. Like I said, a potato is a potato. It doesn't really matter if I grow it, if my neighbor grows it, or somebody, whatever. It's mostly the same, and like I say, because everyone's growing them and there's so many in the market, the individual firm has no control over the price. So that creates our horizontal or perfectly elastic demand curve. This is where we do our side-by-side graphs, right? So it doesn't matter which side you put them on. I always like the market on the left. I think it's easier to extrapolate over, but bottom line is, in our potato market, this is the total market for potatoes, you have a normal looking supply and demand graph. Like any other supply and demand graph that we've done, you have your upward sloping supply, your downward sloping demand, creating our equilibrium price and quantity, right? Easy peasy. Now, what happens then is the market, remember, determines the price, okay? So the price is determined by supply and demand. This price comes over then and creates our horizontal marginal revenue and demand curve. Now, this is also the price for the firm, okay? So you can call that PE or whatever you want. That's the price for the firm. But basically what this is saying is that the firm can produce and sell as many potatoes or whatever as they want at the market price. They can produce 100 bushels, 200 bushels, 300 bushels, 400 bushels, and so forth. And again, if I increase my production a little bit or decrease it a little bit, out of millions and millions and millions of potatoes grown, it's not by itself going to make a significant difference. So I really can't change how much is going to be made. And so that creates our horizontal, or what we call perfectly elastic demand curve, which is the same as marginal revenue. Now remember, when you draw these, and on this particular free response, because we're doing it at home, there's not going to be any drawing of graphs, but if you're ever in a position where you're having to draw these, remember you always want for your firm 4 curves. If you miss any one of these curves, you're not going to give all the information that you need to give. Now you say, wait a minute, Merz, there's only 3 curves over there. What are you talking about? Well, one curve doubles up and serves 2 functions, and then that's of course our MR and D curve is the same there. So you always want your MR and D curve, you want your MC curve, and you want your ATC. Now why do you want all of those? Because demand determines the price. We have to know what the price is. MR and MC determines where we produce, right? Our profit maximizing output, which I'll remind you of in a second. So you have to have an MR and MC curve to tell us where we're going to produce. And ATC determines whether or not you're making profit, okay? So if you don't have those 4 curves, we're not going to know one of these pieces of information, the price. We're not going to know how many they're producing, and we're not going to know, and/or we're not going to know whether or not they're making money, okay? So you've got to have all those 4 curves. Any type of market, perfect competition, monopoly, Monopolistic competition, if they ask you to draw an oligopoly graph, which is unlikely, but any type of competition, gotta have those 4 curves. Missing one of those, you will miss points, I promise you. So, at any rate, so we've got our graph here, and this particular one, of course, I didn't want to do that. Why don't you go over here? Where are you? Now, come on, help me out. Be nice to me. There we go. All right. What just happened? Did I say go up there? All right, let me try this again. No, not long run. Okay, technical difficulties. There we go. Now be nice to me. All right, so this is in, it could be short run or long run. Any long run situation is also a short run situation, but mostly we'd call this long run because the firm in this particular case is breaking even, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. The key thing though is, like I said a second ago, you always want to produce at the intersection of MR and MC. Now, if you think about that, that makes sense because as long as the additional money you're bringing in is greater than the additional cost to produce more, nets you more profit. That's good. You like profit, right? If you go beyond this point and the additional cost of the next unit is greater than what I'm getting for the unit, getting paid for the unit, no good. My profit starts to decline at that point. So anything before this point, you're leaving profits on the table that you could have realized. We all want another dollar. Anything after this point, you are going to start losing profit because now it costs more to make than what you're getting, and that's not good. Okay, so that's what our equilibrium looks like. So real quick reminder of the areas where you're making profit, losing, all that kind of stuff, right? So this first up here, if we want to call it P1, we can do that. Okay, so let's say this was your price. Remember, envision on this left side the market. Okay, let's say your supply and demand is such that the price is up here. This is what we call a profit maximizing point because, and this is important, where MR, remember this is your MR and demand curve, okay? Price creates the MR and demand curve. So where your MR equals MC is above your average total cost. As long as the price you're getting is greater than what it's costing you on average to make those units, you make money, right? So this firm is making, we would say technically economic profit, right? Because we're economists, that's what we're concerned with. So you're making economic profit. This one right here, we'll call it P2. This is a break-even point, and the reason is where your MR, remember, so this dotted line is your MR curve, MR and demand. Where it intersects MC, like the graph above, is at ATC. So in other words, you get $10 per pizza. It costs you on average $10 per pizza. Well, guess what? You make 0. Now again, when we say make 0, that means you make 0 economic profit. That means all things being equal, if you had done other things, you're breaking even. 0 economic profit doesn't mean you're not making any money. You are making positive accounting profit, okay? But you're making 0 economic profit. All right, this third one, we can call it P3. This is what we call loss minimizing because, again, where this MR curve intersects MC is below your ATC, right? At this quantity here. Okay, if I were to draw this down, just to make this look fancy, if this quantity here, okay, is lower than the average total cost at that quantity. And so, if it costs you $10 to make a pizza, but you only sell them for $8, bad news, you're losing money. But, here's the key, and we all know this, as long as your price is still above AVC, you make money. And you say, Merz, why would you want to produce if you're losing money? Well, you don't lose as much as if you didn't produce at all because you have some what are called sunk costs, okay? You already paid for your figure. You've paid $1,000 for your pizza oven, no refunds, no exchanges, okay? So $1,000 is down the hole. If you produce, maybe you make, as long as your price is greater than your variable costs, you're going to eat away at some of that loss. So you can either not produce and lose $1,000 that you spend on your pizza oven, or you can produce and say only lose $600. Now, if you had the choice between losing $1,000 or losing $600, you'd rather just lose $600. So as long as your price is above your variable costs, you keep producing, even though you are losing money in the short run. Now, if the price, we'll call like this one here, P4, ever falls below average variable cost, get out. Okay, so you lose $1,000 on your pizza oven. The more pizzas you make, the more money you lose. Okay, so 1,000 is the least you're ever going to lose if you don't produce at all. So at that point, you are out of the game and your time is over. Okay, so just kind of a reminder of where that price is. Above, if your price where it intersects MR and MC, if your price is above ATC, making profit. At ATC, break even. Between ATC and AVC, okay, as below ATC but above AVC, that's our loss minimizing. You stay in the game even though you lose. Below AVC, get out of there. All right, now let's real quick remind you all of what happens in the long run. I don't know how well you can see this graph, but hopefully you can. So, two scenarios that happen in the short run and then how we adjust in the long run. So the first scenario is, let's say that firms are making profit. Okay, now, when firms, and that's what this is indicating here, okay, you've got your price, which is, okay, remember your MR and D curve, okay, wherever it intersects, MC is right there. That's above your average total cost. What did we say a moment ago? You're making profit. Good job. Okay, economic profit. Now, when you're in this boat, okay, in the long run, that is important. Okay, in the short run, is there enough time? Let's say again, you're a potato farmer and you're making a killing this season, right? Is there enough time halfway through the season for soybean farmers to plow under their soybeans and plant potatoes? No, that's not how it works. They've already halfway grown their soybeans. Even though they might not make as much money as you or maybe even lose money, you might as well finish growing them soybeans because you ain't going to grow anything else. There's not enough time. So in the short run, nothing can change as far as firms are concerned. In the long run, however, okay, again, last year, potato farmers made a killing. Soybean farmers lost money. You were a soybean farmer. You're going to think to yourself, didn't do so well with soybeans last year, but man, those potato farmers, they're driving new cars and they've got hot girlfriends. I want in on that, right? So what are you going to grow next year? You're going to grow potatoes. And so what happens is those profits, and if they ask you to explain, this is important, you have to mention the word profits. If you don't, you will not get a point for the explain, I promise you. So you got to say, in the long run, profits are going to draw new firms in, and that's going to increase my supply curve. And I don't know if I did this at the right spot, but hopefully it's close enough. But it's going to increase supply because you have all these new potato growers, right? You have a new price and quantity here, and of course that gets extrapolated over. If I did that, pretty close. Creates a new price, demand, and marginal revenue curve for the firm, and you come back to break even. I always like to think of the example. You're at the grocery store. There's 4 grocery lanes open. 3 of them have long lines. One of them has almost no line. What do people do? People leave their long lines and go to the short line. You're never going to see that for a sustained period of time. You're never going to see one checkout line that has always got nobody in it, and then these others that always have long lines. People are going to move accordingly, and those lines generally are going to be pretty balanced. That's kind of what's happening here when you think about it, right? Those profits, in this case, losses in a second, are going to either draw firms in or kick them out, and they always kind of come back to that equilibrium point, okay, that long run point where they're breaking even economically. Okay, so that's where they're making money. Down here, this is a loss minimizing situation. Now, how do we know it's loss minimizing? Well, remember, here's where MR equals MC, and look at where this price is. It's between the 2 curves. It's between ATC and AVC. Okay, if it's between the 2, you're losing money, but you stay in the game. Now, what happens here? This year, again, these are our soybean farmers from last year, right? They lost money this year. Some soybean farmers are going to say, enough with soybeans. Again, I want to go to potatoes because they made money. As firms leave in the long run, again, you're not going to do this in the short run. You're already halfway through your growing season. You're not going to give up on your soybeans, okay, and grow nothing this year. You might as well finish growing your soybeans and make something back. But next year, time to replant in the long run. Okay, what are we going to do? Well, some firms are going to leave. As firms leave, that shifts supply curve in the market to the left because now there are fewer soybean farmers, whatever market this is. And notice that brings the price back up to our break even. Again, that's how things balance in the long run. Firms either enter or exit. In this case, losses are pushing out firms, and those firms leaving causes supply to decrease. That makes price go up, and now the remaining firms, they start coming back up to break even. Okay, so in the long run, perfectly competitive firms always always come to break even. okay, for that reason. All right, then two other real quick definitions that are important. Allocative efficiency and productive efficiency. Allocative efficiency essentially means that you made the exact right amount, there is no deadweight loss. In a regular market, of course, we say that's where supply meets demand. Well, we essentially have the supply and demand curves on these markets, right? So let's come back up. This is a good example. So you've got your marginal revenue, which is the same as your demand, and you might say, well, where's our supply curve? Well, remember, the marginal cost curve is pretty much the same as the supply curve. They represent the same thing. So basically, what is allocative efficiency? I like to think of it simply where you're producing where supply meets demand. Well, because supply is the same as MC, and because MR is the same as D, if you always produce where MR equals MC, you are also always going to be producing where demand meets supply. So the good news is about perfectly competitive markets is they always achieve allocative efficiency. There is no deadweight loss with these firms. You can look there, you can look in the long run, okay? In other situations, even here, this is where they're making profit. You're still producing if this MC is the same as supply. You're still producing where supply meets demand. If you look at this scenario where they're losing money, okay, supply again, because MR is D and MC is supply, you're always producing where supply meets demand. So you always get allocative efficiency no matter what. Productive efficiency means you're producing at minimum ATC, the lowest possible point that ATC can be. Now, you will only get this in the long run. Again, let me show you. Here, okay, if you're producing at this point right here, that is the lowest point on the ATC curve. You cannot possibly produce that cheaper at any particular output. Okay, but if you notice in the short run, okay, let me get rid of this here real quick, mess it up. In the short run, okay, they are producing where MR equals MC, which is right here on the ATC curve. Now, is that the lowest point of ATC? No, it is not. You can kind of see that, but you also know it's not the lowest point because that's not where MC intersects it. MC always intersects at the lowest point, and you'll see the same thing on this graph down here. Okay, a little bit harder to read this one, but they're producing right here. Again, that's slightly off where MC intersects got to go up here, okay? So that's not quite where MC intersects ATC, so you know it's not the lowest point. So productive efficiency you do achieve in the long run, but not in the short run. Now the other types of competitions, under natural circumstances, you don't get either of these. Perfect competition is the only one that gets either allocative or productive efficiency. Okay, allocative all the time, productive long run only. All right, there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully that helps. Answer some questions and clear up some confusion. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. And until next time, behave yourselves.